It began as a whirlwind romance, the kind that seemed almost too good to be true. For Derek and Alice, life had unfolded like a perfect dream, a chance encounter, an instant connection, and the kind of deep, soulful bond that many people spend their entire lives searching for. Derek, a 30-year-old software engineer with a sharp mind and a calm demeanor, had been working tirelessly on his career for years. Love had always seemed elusive to him, a concept more suited to fairy tales and movies than to his own reality. That was until Alice appeared, seemingly out of nowhere. Alice was unlike anyone Derek had ever met. She was beautiful, confident, and intelligent, with a wit that left him in awe. From the moment they met, he was enchanted by her, a tall, graceful woman with long, flowing dark hair and bright, expressive eyes. They shared interests, a similar sense of humor, and a love for adventure that had them traveling together almost as soon as they started dating. Their connection felt effortless, and within 6 months, Derek was on one knee, proposing to Alice on a mountaintop during one of their hiking trips. She said yes, her smile radiating warmth as she accepted the ring. Their wedding, a modest but elegant affair, followed soon after, attended by close family and friends. It was everything Derek could have hoped for, the vows, the first dance, the promises of a lifetime spent together. He was blissfully in love, content in the belief that he had found the one person he could truly share his life with. But beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect relationship, there was a secret, one that Alice had kept hidden from Derek for as long as they had known each other, a secret that, once revealed, would shatter everything. The first few weeks of their marriage were blissful. Derek and Alice had moved into a charming suburban home just outside of the city. It was small but cozy, with enough space for the two of them to start a family someday. Derek loved coming home from work to find Alice in the kitchen preparing dinner, her soft laughter filling the air as they talked about their day. They spent their evenings curled up on the couch, watching movies or discussing their future. Derek couldn't imagine being happier. But as time went on, Derek began to notice subtle changes in Alice's behavior. She seemed more distant at times, as though something was weighing heavily on her mind. There were moments when she would retreat into herself, her laughter fading, her gaze turning somber. When Derek asked her what was wrong, she would always brush it off, assuring him that everything was fine. But her reassurances did little to ease his growing concern. Derek loved Alice with all his heart, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was keeping something from him. He tried to push the thoughts aside, telling himself that every marriage had its ups and downs. After all, they had only been married for a few months. They were still adjusting to life together, still learning how to navigate the complexities of sharing a home and building a future. But the nagging sense that something wasn't right lingered in the back of his mind. It was a rainy afternoon when Derek's world came crashing down. He had come home from work early, hoping to surprise Alice with flowers and a romantic evening. As he walked through the front door, he noticed the house was unusually quiet. He called out her name but received no response. Assuming she was out running errands, he made his way upstairs to their bedroom. As he entered the room, he spotted Alice's laptop sitting open on the bed. A wave of curiosity washed over him. Alice had always been very private about her personal devices, never leaving them unlocked or unattended. Derek hesitated for a moment, then sat down on the bed and glanced at the screen. What he saw made his heart stop. There, on the screen, was an email conversation between Alice and a close friend of hers, one that Derek had never met. The messages were long and deeply personal, filled with words that Derek had never heard from Alice before. And then, there it was, the secret that would change everything. In one of the messages, Alice had confided in her friend about her past. She had been born male and had transitioned years before meeting Derek. The conversation detailed her fears about Derek finding out and how she had planned to tell him eventually, but the right moment had never come. Derek stared at the screen, his mind reeling. He couldn't believe what he was reading. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him, leaving him suspended in a state of shock. How could this be possible? How could Alice have kept something so important from him? He felt a wave of anger rising within him, anger at the deception, anger at the lies. But beneath the anger, there was also a deep sense of betrayal. Derek had always prided himself on being open-minded and accepting, but this was different. This was personal. This was his wife, the woman he had vowed to spend the rest of his life with, and she had been hiding something so fundamental about herself. Derek felt as though his entire marriage had been built on a lie. That evening, when Alice returned home, Derek was waiting for her in the living room. His mind was racing, his emotions a volatile mix of confusion, hurt, and anger. He hadn't said a word to her since she walked through the door, but the tension in the air was palpable. Alice immediately sensed that something was wrong. She set down her bag and approached him cautiously. "Derek, is everything okay?" Derek didn't answer at first. He stood up from the couch, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and strained. "I know." Alice's face went pale. What do you mean?" "I know everything," Derek said, his voice rising. "I saw the emails, Alice. I know about your past. Why didn't you tell me?" Alice's eyes filled with tears as she realized what had happened. She tried to reach out to him, but Derek recoiled, his anger boiling over. "How could you lie to me like this?" he shouted. "How could you keep something like this from me? I thought I knew you." "I wanted to tell you," Alice said, her voice trembling. "I just didn't know how. I was scared, Derek. I was scared you wouldn't love me if you knew the truth." Derek shook his head, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. "How could you marry me without telling me? How could you let me fall in love with you, knowing that you were keeping this from me?" Tears streamed down Alice's face. "I didn't want to hurt you. I love you, Derek. I love you more than anything." But Derek couldn't hear her. All he could think about was the betrayal, the deception that had been at the heart of their relationship. He stormed out of the house, leaving Alice standing alone in the living room, her heart breaking as she watched him walk away. In the days that followed, Derek didn't return home. He couldn't bear to face Alice, couldn't bear the thought of looking her in the eyes after what he had discovered. He stayed with a friend, drowning his sorrows in alcohol and sleepless nights. His mind was consumed by the revelation, by the questions that plagued him at every turn. Had their entire relationship been a lie? Did Alice ever truly love him, or had she only been using him to hide her secret? Derek's thoughts spiraled into a dark place, the lines between love and hate blurring in his mind. Meanwhile, Alice was left alone in their home, devastated by the fallout of their confrontation. She had always known that there was a risk in not telling Derek sooner, but she had never imagined it would end like this. She loved him deeply, but now it seemed as though that love had been twisted into something unrecognizable. Alice tried reaching out to Derek, calling and texting him in the hopes that they could talk things through, but each time her messages went unanswered. She knew that Derek needed time, but she feared that he might never come back. It was a week later when Derek finally returned home. He was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot from days of drinking and sleeplessness. He had spent the past few days wrestling with his emotions, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. But as he walked through the front door, he realized that there were no easy answers. Alice was sitting at the kitchen table when he entered, her face pale and drawn. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "Derek," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I'm so sorry." Derek stood in the doorway, his hands trembling at his sides. He wanted to scream, to shout, to make her understand the depth of his pain. But all he could do was stare at her, the woman he had once loved so completely, and feel the weight of the betrayal between them. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Derek said finally, his voice raw with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way. Alice's heart shattered at his words, but she knew that he had every right to feel the way he did. She had lied to him, kept a part of herself hidden for fear of losing him. But in the end, her silence had caused the very thing she had been trying to avoid. "Please," Alice begged, her voice trembling. "Please just give me a chance to make this right. I love you, Derek. I've always loved you." Derek's face hardened. "I don't even know who you are anymore." And with that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Alice alone once again. As the days turned into weeks, the distance between Derek and Alice only grew. Derek had moved out of their home, refusing to speak to Alice or respond to her messages. He was consumed by his anger and hurt, unable to see a way forward from the betrayal he had experienced. Alice, on the other hand, was devastated by the loss of her marriage. She had always known that telling Derek about her past would be difficult, but she had never imagined it would end like this. She had loved him with all her heart, but now that love seemed to have been poisoned by the lies and secrets she had kept. It was late one night when Derek finally returned, but he was heavily drunk and started a heated argument with Alice. In the heat of the moment, as their argument reached a fever pitch, Derek lost control. His hands, trembling with rage, reached for Alice, grabbing her in a moment of blind fury. He didn't mean to hurt her, didn't mean for things to go as far as they did, but before he knew it, Alice was on the floor, her body motionless. The room fell into an eerie silence, the only sound Derek's ragged breathing as he stood over her, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. He knelt beside Alice, shaking her, calling out her name, but she didn't respond. Panic set in as he realized what he had done. "Oh God," Derek whispered, his voice barely audible. "What have I done?" In a state of shock, Derek stumbled out of the house, his mind racing. He didn't know what to do. His thoughts were a chaotic jumble of fear, guilt, and disbelief. He hadn't meant for this to happen. He hadn't meant to hurt her. He ran, fleeing from the scene of the crime, hoping that somehow he could escape the reality of what he had done. Alice's body was discovered later that evening after a concerned neighbor heard the commotion and called the police. The investigators arrived at the scene, finding Alice lifeless on the floor of the couple's home. There were signs of a struggle but no immediate clues as to who was responsible. Derek was nowhere to be found. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that Derek was the prime suspect. The police discovered the emails on Alice's laptop, revealing the secret she had kept from her husband. It didn't take long for the pieces to fall into place: the heated argument, Derek's sudden disappearance, and the tragic outcome. For days, Derek was on the run, hiding from the authorities as he grappled with the enormity of what he had done. But the guilt was too much to bear. He knew that he couldn't run forever. Eventually, Derek turned himself in, walking into a police station with his head hung low, ready to face the consequences of his actions. The trial was a media spectacle, drawing attention from across the country. The story of a newlywed husband discovering his wife's transgender identity and the resulting tragedy captivated the public's imagination. Both Derek and Alice's families were thrust into the spotlight, their private pain laid bare for the world to see. Derek's defense team argued that he had acted in the heat of the moment, overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't control. They painted a picture of a man who had been deceived, whose world had been turned upside down by a secret that shattered the foundation of his marriage. But the prosecution argued that Derek's actions were inexcusable, that no amount of emotional turmoil could justify the taking of another person's life. They presented evidence of the physical altercation, highlighting the fact that Derek had left Alice to die, fleeing the scene rather than seeking help. The trial was long and grueling, with both sides presenting emotional testimony. Derek's family spoke of the loving, kind man they had known, struggling to reconcile that image with the man who had killed his wife. Alice's family, devastated by her death, spoke of the pain and loss they felt, their daughter's life cut tragically short by a man. This section concludes the tragic story of Derek and Alice, bringing together themes of love, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of secrets. The aftermath of the trial leaves both families shattered. Derek is found guilty of manslaughter, sentenced to years in prison for his reckless actions. His family struggles with the knowledge that the son they once knew was capable of such violence, while Alice's family is overwhelmed with grief for a daughter who overcame so much, only to have her life cut short in such a horrific way. Derek reflects on his actions from behind bars, trying to come to terms with the guilt and loss that will haunt him forever. Through counseling, he confronts the insecurities and toxic masculinity that contributed to his inability to accept Alice's truth. Meanwhile, Alice's family, devastated by her death, channels their pain into creating a foundation in her name, aimed at supporting LGBTQ+ individuals and fostering greater understanding and acceptance. Despite the media moving on to other stories, the lessons of Derek and Alice's short-lived marriage continue to resonate. Their story serves as a reminder of the dangers of keeping secrets and the importance of honesty and communication in relationships. Derek, now fully aware of what he has lost, can only reflect on how things might have been different had he embraced Alice for who she truly was. His final words, "I would have loved Alice for who she truly was, but now it's too late," encapsulate the heartbreaking regret that lingers in the aftermath of this tragedy. This episode of Shadowed Secrets closes with a call for empathy and understanding, urging society to create spaces where people can live authentically without fear of judgment or rejection. It's a poignant reflection on the fragility of love and the high cost of secrets. The story of Derek and Alice is a powerful reminder of the importance of love, acceptance, and the need to foster environments where honesty can thrive. As the years passed, Derek's time in prison was marked by introspection and personal growth. He spent countless hours reflecting on his choices, the uncontrollable anger that had led to Alice's death, and the deep-rooted fear and insecurity that had driven him to such a dark place. His days were monotonous, but he began to find solace in the small moments of clarity during his counseling sessions. He continued to explore the toxic beliefs that had shaped his reaction to Alice's secret, and slowly, he started to understand the importance of acceptance, not only of others but of himself. Derek kept a journal, writing letters to Alice that she would never read. These entries were filled with remorse, apologies, and a growing awareness of the pain he had caused. He wrote about the life they could have had, about the ways in which he had failed her, and about the love he still felt for her despite everything. In his letters, he confessed his guilt and expressed a desire to make amends, though he knew that no amount of reflection could undo what had happened. Meanwhile, Alice's foundation became a beacon of hope for the LGBTQ+ community. Her family, though still mourning, found purpose in their mission to honor her memory. They organized events, provided educational resources, and worked tirelessly to spread awareness about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of creating safe spaces for individuals to live their truth. The foundation grew, helping countless people who were grappling with their own identities and offering support to those who feared rejection or violence. One day, several years into his sentence, Derek received a letter from Alice's mother. He had never expected to hear from her, and when he saw her name on the envelope, his hands trembled as he opened it. The letter was not filled with anger or accusations, as he had feared. Instead, it was a plea for him to continue working on himself, to find a way to become the person Alice had once believed he could be. Her mother expressed her sorrow, not just for Alice's loss, but for Derek's too. She acknowledged the complexity of their situation, the love that had once existed between them, and how fear and misunderstanding had tragically torn them apart. She wrote, "Derek, you took my daughter from me, and that is a pain I will never fully recover from. But I also know that you are not the monster the world has painted you to be. You were a man who loved her, a man who was hurt and confused, and who made an irreversible mistake. I hope, in time, you can find peace within yourself." Alice would have wanted that. The letter was a turning point for Derek. He read it over and over again, struggling with the weight of both the forgiveness and the pain it carried. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to grieve properly, not just for Alice but for the life they had lost together. As the years went by, Derek continued to serve his time, working diligently to better himself. He became involved in prison programs, helping others who were struggling with their own emotional turmoil. His efforts were recognized by the prison staff, and eventually, after serving the majority of his sentence, Derek was granted parole for good behavior. Upon his release, Derek faced the daunting task of rebuilding his life. The world had changed since he had been locked away, and so had he. He was no longer the man who had reacted with rage and fear on that fateful night. He had learned to confront his emotions, to understand the importance of empathy, and to live with the consequences of his actions. Derek's first stop after his release was Alice's grave. Standing there, he felt the weight of everything he had lost and the enormity of the second chance he had been given. He knelt by her headstone, placed his hand on the cold granite, and whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He knew that his apology could never bring Alice back, but in that moment, he felt a small measure of peace that he had been searching for since the day his world had shattered. He vowed to spend the rest of his life honoring her memory, carrying forward the lessons he had learned the hard way. Derek eventually found work with Alice's foundation, dedicating his time to helping others who were struggling with identity, acceptance, and the complexities of relationships. Though he knew he could never undo the past, he was determined to make sure that no one else would have to face the same tragedy he and Alice had endured. In the end, Derek's story was one of loss and redemption, a life forever marked by tragedy but also by the possibility of change. Though the shadow of that fateful night would always linger, Derek found a way to turn his pain into something meaningful, something that could help others and, in a small way, make amends for the love that had been lost. Alice's legacy lived on through the foundation, through the lives she had touched, and through the man who had once loved her more than anything. And while Derek would always carry the burden of what he had done, he had finally found a way to live with the scars, determined to ensure that her story, their story, would not be forgotten.